Hello again, and thank you for joining me in this, the third and final chapter regarding my year spent inside the works of Cogsworth. For those of you here for the first time, I was very fortunate to be cast in the very first year of Disney's Beauty and the Beast 2000 tour, a tour that covered quite a bit of the country's territory, quite successfully, over a few years. I should mention, before I proceed, that as a cast, we were met with some close calls right from the starting gate, the most serious being a car accident involving several cast members en route to Memphis, Tennessee, only a few weeks into our run. Well, fortunately, in time, those who were seriously injured were able to return to the cast before my own departure several months later. But as a result of the accident, and very quickly, the emotional vulnerability that comes with touring became very apparent to me. Luckily, my partner Bob would visit us frequently as his work schedule allowed, and I was blessed to have fostered a handful of wonderful supportive friends among the cast. Importantly, I learned to take care of myself physically, based on some advice I received from a veteran of the original cast. I knew in advance that the weight of Cogsworth's costume would be constantly pulling me forward during performances. So, about 3 months prior to rehearsals, I began working with a trainer in New York City and finding the best weight routines for strengthening my shoulders and back in order to support it. I kept up the routine by hiring a trainer from city to city, but luckily for me, when we arrived in Norfolk, Virginia, a gentleman joined the cast who was a professional trainer, and I was able to work with him as he provided me with some healthy incentive for the rest of my run. The support paid off as I only incurred a slight injury inside of that entire year. Remaining centered and flexible as an actor was a precept of my training at BU's School of Fine Arts. I rarely had an opportunity, though, to test the limits of developing a strong technique because the majority of my runs up until this time were relatively short by comparison. Now, as I mentioned earlier, our great cast was a solid and a seasoned one. Gin rummy and Canadian dirty martinis helped me in bonding with some lifelong friends. And by the way, a Canadian dirty martini is made by subbing out the olive brine for an eye drop of Scotch whiskey. But even with our fellowship, there were times when exhaustion made for strange bedfellows, and the technique I developed while rehearsing was relied on more than I'd anticipated when I found that the bloom was occasionally off the rose. And here's my story. A good part of our January was spent in Buffalo, bluesy upstate New York Buffalo winters. We were playing at the Shea Theater, a sumptuous house designed by Louis Comfort Tiffany and one of the most beautiful theaters in the country. But the winter doldrums of cabin fever were upon me, and I was having a particularly challenging matinee that afternoon. Dedicated as I like to think I am, I was experiencing one of those occasional sinking, what's it all about moments that sometimes comes after several weeks into what you know will be a long run ahead. I remember leaving the stage door quickly and rather slumped over. I loved the whole ritual of signing autographs at the stage door as people try to figure out who had played what as they watched us exit in our street clothes. But I was guilty of making a too harsh retreat this particular time. I felt it best to just dash back to the Doubletree Hotel for a quick between-shows nap. But as I was escaping, I started to hear some hurried footsteps behind me. So I turned around just to see what the commotion was about, and a woman was running towards me with a quizzical look on her face. As I found myself rooted on the spot, she came up to me and she excused herself in advance for having possibly made a mistake. But was I the actor who played Cogsworth? Well, I told her that yes, I was indeed the guy. And she asked if it would be at all possible for me to return to the theater's parking lot with her and say hello to her son. Well, flattery found my spirits rising. I mean, how could I resist meeting this young man after having made such an impression on him? So I remember zigzagging our way through the exiting traffic and our moving towards a larger van than I expected to see, parked alone in the lot. And as we got closer, I began to have a creeping sense of something more than I'd expected. Just an instinct, but an emotionally loaded one. And as we were getting closer to the van, and now that this woman, this mom, was feeling more secure with my having agreed to join her, she began to tell me her son's story. That his lifeline had always been a breathing apparatus that completely surrounded him. They had made their plans to see the musical, expecting to have a nice afternoon's entertainment, but somehow and unexpectedly, it brought her son to life. Of all the characters' plights that the musical represents in its plotline, he had identified most with mine, with Cogsworth's. When he saw my transformation from clock to being human again, he recognized the possibility of something new, something he'd evidently not shared with his parents before: hope and freedom. His parents recognized this, and that was the reason for their request, for their son to see me as human. Well, I was dumbstruck. I couldn't think of a thing to say to her. She walked me to the van's door, and her husband slid it open, said hello, and introduced me to their beautiful son. He was probably in his early teens. He didn't say hello. Perhaps he was unable to for any number of reasons. He just stared at me, and I had all I could do to hold it together. I introduced myself. There was a held silence between us for a moment. They thanked me, and they were gone. It was an instant that held the length of a lifetime. I was pretty much locked on the spot as they drove away, mother and father waving back to me, their son held in place, restricted by his lifeline of tubes and wires. I promised myself, then and there, that I would never again question the potential power we have as creatives, as actors, as celebrants. If even a handful of people choose to surrender themselves to what we commit to, and with our commitment comes our credibility, whether amateur or professional, there's the possibility of catharsis being mined. And that gift ricochets back to us. It's in the air that we breathe and share with an appreciative audience. And in this time of a pandemic, it's sorely missed by those of us who love and thrive inside of that special communion. I thank God that I turned around to meet that woman and to forcibly break away from the torpid state of mind I had on that late afternoon. I certainly don't remember taking a nap like I'd intended to. I'd experienced the catharsis myself this time. My being led to that young man was the highlight of that entire year. And being privileged to be human, again, at the end of each performance, well, it suddenly began to haunt me. Stay human. Be well. Remain engaged. And hope to see you next time.